Hey everyone. Um, I just wanted to give some background in this video on the life of John Milton and just really hone in on that 17th century English historical context in which he lived his life in, and in which, of course, he wrote Paradise Lost in throughout the 1660s towards the end of his life. And just side note, this is extremely important to understand because we live in a culture that's very much um, subjectivizing literature, literary criticism, how to read a great book or even a non great book. And the problem with that is that John Milton lived in a very different time than us. John Milton had certain beliefs, certain convictions, experiences, a certain upbringing and education, certain biases, even things that just influenced his writing very deeply. And so, keeping in touch with the historical critical school of literary theory, literary criticism, where we try to understand the author in their own context before we try to talk about them further or understand them. We're trying to avoid imposing our own meaning on the text as much as possible, though if at times we're not exactly going to be able to know what he's talking about without extremely serious time in the scholarship. But just wanted to give some context to Milton's life and basically what was going on in this time and how that may affect the text. So, first and foremost, in his early life, John Milton was born on December 9th, 1608, in London. He was born in an upper middle class family. They were very adamantly Puritan in their religious practice and conviction, and he grew up near St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, and the House of Parliament, all very historic places and significant places, not just as historical monuments in our time, but significant places in Milton's time as well. So he really was in the epicenter of English culture in his time. In this time, King James was on the throne, so this was the end of the Elizabethan era, where King James took over. He'll later be succeeded by a major player in this time, King Charles I, who was the father, of course, of King Charles II. We'll get to all that shortly. And think in this time, Milton being born in the first decade of the 17th century, this is a time where Shakespeare is finishing out his career writing. He's written a lot of his major and most famous works by this point, and he's going to be writing his last dramas, his last plays at this point, and is going to die shortly after. This is also a time where the great metaphysical poet John Donne, his poems are circulating around. I have a copy of his works right here and would highly recommend reading some John Donne in your time when you get a chance. And also Ben Jonson and his company are they're meeting at the Mermaid Tavern regularly and discussing literary works and other things over glasses of fine wine at this time, much like the Inklings will do one day in the 20th century. Those C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien and company. Um, as far as his education, um, John Milton was educated at St. Paul's School next to St. Paul's Cathedral, as mentioned earlier. And this is one of, if not the best schools for a boy to be educated in all of England. It's rigorous. The tutors there are world class. This is the place where you're going to get just the most top-notch education, and Milton is one of the most educated Englishmen of his time, of probably of the entire 17th century, for that matter. Um, the school specialized in the humanities as well as the Latin and Greek grammar, syntax, language, and the literary tradition as well for those. And so Milton was especially talented in Latin. He's going to write a lot of prose and verse in classical Latin at a pretty young age, honestly. Before he's even 20, he's already taking shots at doing that, and it's going to be influential throughout his life. Along with that, keeping with the spirit of the quadrivium, he grew up playing the organ and the viola at home. You got to think there's no television. You can't turn on Paramount Plus or Disney Plus or Netflix or whatever people are watching these days. And not only that, but he doesn't have a radio or a lot of other things to do. So they played a lot of music at home as a family, which is really cool. We should return to some of that, in my opinion. So he's musically inclined as well, getting a full, robust education, as he will recommend to others in his 1644 treatise of education. In addition to all of this, if this wasn't already enough education or profound enough, his father actually paid for him to have private tutors come to their home and to focus on subjects that were not offered in St. Paul's. Some of these would include the some of the more modern vernacular languages on the continent. So French and Italian, which were very major poetic languages in the Renaissance, but even for good 300 years or so leading up to the Renaissance, maybe a little more for French, and Hebrew as well, because they were Puritans, they loved the Bible, and they thought it was important that Milton could just not just go through the New Testament in Greek, but could actually read the Hebrew Old Testament himself, and that's going to be very influential on Paradise Lost as well. So he likely learned some Hebrew at the end of his education at St. Paul's, because they did offer that to people in their last year or two at the school. But either way, however, John Milton learned Hebrew. He knew Hebrew very well before he even went to college, which he was like 16 or 17 at most when he was going to college. Crazy for us to probably all think about. As for college, he went to the University of Cambridge, obviously a very prestigious school today, and was one of the major prestigious schools, along with Oxford in England, of his time and even in the Middle Ages. So when he goes to Cambridge, he's an expert in English, Latin, and Greek, and he's not an expert, but still highly proficient in Italian, French, and Hebrew. And again, he was probably about 16 or 17 at this time. Crazy to imagine. And in his spare time, amongst being educated and doing his studies, he was also trying to write on his own some. This is where he wrote the poem Ode on the Morning of Christ's Nativity, which you can still read today, and he was trying his hand at writing Latin poetry as well in this time. And he eventually graduated with a bachelor's in the 1630 and a master's in 1632. And there's an important caveat here, because we might think he only had a bachelor's and a master's and his education was this profound. Well, our education is very watered down today. Having a bachelor's and a master's, it's a feat and it's an accomplishment. It's no simple thing, and some programs are harder than others, of course, in today's day and age. But having a bachelor's and a master's degree today likely doesn't mean you're proficient in multiple European and ancient languages and have read and studied all these profound works. So just know it's a very different time. To have a bachelor's and a master's degree is, in his time, is a lot more than it would be to have a PhD in most places today. So just keep that in mind. After Cambridge, Milton's actually pretty dissatisfied with his education at Cambridge for a variety of reasons, but he's actually going to do further study, independent, rigorous study on his own. His parents retired out to the country in this time, which, of course, most people in Milton's time didn't have the equivalent of a ginormous 401k to retire, but upper middle class people did. So they're retired out into the English countryside, and Milton will go here and do in-depth study and continue his writing career, as poetry is really what Milton is always going to be the most passionate about, despite spending a ton of his time involved in English politics in the middle of the 17th century. So he's going to compose two poems, El Allegro and Il Penseroso. These are poems that you can also read today, which I would commend to you, but it was likely that he wrote those at this time. Scholars vary on all these things, as scholars do, but those poems were written, if not at least influenced and inspired at this time. And so with all this education, you might think, what is Milton going to do with that? What's the end of this, right? What's he going to do for the greater good, the kingdom of God, the English society, his family? What's he going to do with that? Well, his parents, and possibly even him at some point, want him to enter the clergy at this time. But Milton really was more driven into poetry and studies in the humanities at his time. So he's going to devote himself to that instead. Of course, like many fathers would be at first, his dad's going to be skeptical of that. He's going to be worried that he's throwing away a prestigious career in the Church of England or as a Puritan or maybe even in politics. But nevertheless, Milton's going to write a masque called Comus, and he's going to write a funeral elegy called Lycidas in this time. These are two poems I would recommend highly to you. These are poems that you should really read and chew on and meditate on throughout the semester. I cannot commend them to you enough. Again, the Dartmouth Reading Room for John Milton has all of these if you don't have an edition that can provide them for you. So he's going to write those in these times as well, and you'll see just various sonnets that come out and when he wrote them throughout his career in life. Now, after that, if you didn't think Milton was educated and successful enough for a guy that's not even 30, he's actually going to get funding from his father to go on a um, at least over a year study in continental Europe. I think it's about 15 months. I'm not sure if he extended it beyond that, but at least 15 months he's going to spend in continental Europe. And he's going to spend most of his time in Italy. He's going to, be in Rome. He's going to be in Florence. He's going to be in Naples. Different Italian communities where he's going to learn from others, read great works of the Italian tradition in their original vernacular tongue. He's going to converse with other intellectuals of his time, and he is going to spend some time in Paris and do the same thing with the French literary tradition as well. And just a note for this time that Italian and French were ever-growing literary traditions in their own. They were really the first vernacular tongues in Western Europe to develop their own literary tradition um, outside of like the Latin-speaking world, which dominated the High Middle Age in the Western society for most of the Middle Ages, really. For example, like Dante wrote the Divine Comedy in Italian, not Latin. And he had reasons for doing that I won't get into right now. But he was a very staunch defender, actually, of writing in the vernacular. Part of that was actually just to compete with the French, but there's other reasons in there as well. But that's going to be popularized. Dante certainly influenced that quite a bit, especially for Italy as well. But vernacular poetry as a long-standing tradition in a sense by this point, at least a couple hundred years. Another noteworthy item in Europe is that Milton actually visited and had conversation with Galileo in this time, which led to some. You certainly see that at least implicitly in Paradise Lost, some inspiration there. But it also led to a work called Areopagitica, which he wrote. It's one of his famous prose works. And certainly the whole Copernican revolution of the 16th century, so really the changing of the way Western society views the cosmos, like the order out in space, or the heavens, as I like to call it, as C.S. Lewis liked to call it. And so Milton's kind of in two worlds there sometimes, where he's influenced by the medieval cosmology because of the classical and medieval literary tradition, but he's also going to be influenced by the ever-growing prominence of the Copernican revolution from the century prior to when he lived. And again, this is very scholarly stuff that's beyond my level to actually parse out when exactly he's drawing on, the medieval cosmos and the medieval spheres, and when he's actually drawing on Copernicus and Galileo and the likes of them. So things to keep in the back of your head as you're reading through the poem, and things to think about and even research if you can. He does plan to spend time in Sicily and Greece, but that's all cut short because England is going to enter a political conflict, and he's going to go back and devote himself to a political career of 20-something years in the middle of his life. So basically, on the conflict in England is going to be essentially between, on the left side, you really have like the English Puritans and the Scottish Presbyterians, who are much more pro-liberty than the right were, which are basically like the High Church Anglicans. This is coming from the tradition of like King Henry VIII being, the king of the and being over the Church of England and like Thomas Cranmer and everything going on in the middle of the 16th century. So we're about 100 years removed from that now. And they also had the support of King Charles the First at this time, of course. So basically, Milton's going to be he's going to be aligned with this group, but he's actually going to be he ends up finding like the Presbyterians who they're not they have a sort of a slightly hierarchical system of church government, much more than like a Baptist or a Congregationalist would have had, but they're not nearly as high church in a sense as like Anglicans would be. But even Milton's even going to find them to be too basically too hierarchical in nature. He's going to be eventually turn against the Presbyterians and really find them to be too authoritarian, which is a little odd to think about. Maybe if you have any background in like church history at all, but nevertheless, that's Milton's view. He's extremely pro liberty, extremely kind of like freedom of conscience, freedom of choice, and all of that, and also things to keep in mind as you read Paradise Lost and see how that influences him writing his characters, especially keep that in mind with Satan and how Satan thinks about tyranny and thinks of God as a tyrant in a lot of ways. Obviously, very wrong in doing so, but more on that later. And note too, this is not none of this represents my views. I am happy to have people who are Baptists or Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Anglicans, whatever in my class. I actually prefer to have a multitude of denominations and voices. But Milton certainly picked sides, and in his time that was probably necessary, as there were a lot of extremes in his time. So one of the major events in England in this century is that King Charles the First is actually executed in 1649, and then Oliver Cromwell and the Protectorate are going to take power and establish the Commonwealth of England, or the Rump Parliament, as it's sometimes known. And civil war is going to ensue for basically throughout like the 1650s until Cromwell dies from a fever in I believe 1658. I apologize, I don't have that written down, but I believe it's 1658. But nevertheless, King Charles II, the son of King Charles I, who has been in continental Europe for most, if not all of this time, is going to return from the continent in 1660 and claim his place on the throne, launching England into a new era, which is known as the Restoration Era. This is really a new era of English literature, as opposed to the English Renaissance, where we associate people like, like Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare and John Donne but Milton's often still referred to as like a late Renaissance author, but don't need to get overly distinct there. Late Renaissance, early Restorationists, they blur a little bit together in the 1660s, 1670s. But naturally, the restoration of the monarchy, Milton being adamantly opposed to the monarchy and the high church culture, it puts Milton on the outs, much like it put Dante on the outs in the conflicts with the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and later the white Guelphs and black Ghibellines in Florentine Italy around like the 1290s, around 1300 AD. There's a lot of parallels to Milton and Dante. That's why I keep mentioning him. I might even do a whole video on that, or at least talk about it at some point. But just know there's some connections there, and much like Dante, Milton is going to spend the end of his life on the outs, kind of in exile, not exactly in the same way, but like Dante, he's going to dedicate the end of his life to poetry and writing one really great epic. So the Divine Comedy is the great epic of really all of the Middle Ages, but especially Italy, and Paradise Lost is going to be that epic for the English literary tradition, and still to this day, many, such as myself, will consider that to be true, still to this day in 2025. Along with all this, Milton also lost his sight throughout the 1640s and was completely blind in 1652, likely had glaucoma, and there was certainly way less they could do about it, going on 400 years ago. But Sonnet 19, which is called, he titled it "When I Consider How My Light Is Spent." The Anglican clergyman John Newton, 100 years later, is going to just title this "On His Blindness." But nevertheless, go and look up this sonnet and read it. You can read it on Google or on Poetry Foundation, the website, or even on the Dartmouth Reading Room as well. But definitely check that one out. Very worth reading and reflecting on to really capture his struggle and how he felt about losing his sight. So to talk about his family a little bit, John Milton he gets married to Mary Powell in 1642. She's only 17 at the time, which is well, much more normal in their culture. But she's actually going to die 10 years later in 1652. However, they are going to have four children together. The oldest is Anne, born in 1646. Mary, born in 1648. Um, his one and only son, John, who was born in 1651 and tragically died 15 months later in 1652. And then he had a third daughter, Deborah, in 1652. So he has four children with Mary, and three of them live, but unfortunately she does pass away. Where 4 years later, in 1656, he's going to marry Catherine Woodcock. She only lives for 2 more years, and then she dies as well. This was um, unimaginable to somebody like me personally who has a family, but this was more common back in the day without modern medicine. Um, they have a daughter named Catherine, and this whole concept of her dying is an inspiration for Sonnet 23 called "Methought I Saw My Late Espoused Saint." Read that one as well with this in mind. Um, and then he'll get married for a third time in his slightly older age, we'll say for the time, to Elizabeth Minshall, and she's actually going to end up outliving him by over 50 years. But he's married to her for the rest of his life at this point, the last 11 years of his life, roughly. He has two nephews, Edward and then John Phillips. They're the sons of his sister Anne, whom he educated personally as they were growing up. Um, John Phillips became a secretary, and Edward is actually the first person to write a biography on John Milton. I have not read it, but I'm sure it would be really interesting to read given his close relationship and that he actually lived with him. Um, so in this period of life, after he's on the outs with the government, this is when he's going to obviously write Paradise Lost, as I mentioned earlier. So he's going to be writing this starting in the early 1660s. It's going to end up being published for the first time in 1667, and really kind of hilarious to think about for some reason in our time. I'm sure if it would have been funny or come off as silly in his time, but since he was blind, you might think, how did he write this? And this is, like many things about Milton, is a very Homeric and a very Homeric parallel. Homer was also known to be blind, and he basically had enlisted his daughters as his like main scribes for writing this, and he would think about Paradise Lost and think about ideas for it, and then to have them write his ideas down, he would, I guess, apparently yell, "I want to be milked," and that's why I say I don't know if this was silly or funny in his time. I definitely chuckled, maybe even laughed out loud a little bit the first time I heard that because it sounds ridiculous. I mean, I'm trying not to laugh a little bit right now at that, and maybe you'll find it humorous too. But nevertheless, they helped to dictate Paradise Lost for him since he was blind. And the first edition is 10 books, but he's going to revise that for about 7 years and come out with a second edition in 1674, which is actually the same year he died. It was right at the end of his life. Um, Along with this period, he's going to write a couple other shorter epics. One called Paradise Regained. It's basically a direct sequel that talks about the life of Christ, the incarnation, and the death and resurrection of Christ, and that is really the sequel and the end of Paradise Lost, talking about the seed of the woman crushing the head of the serpent, and that's what Paradise Regained is about, right? It's the gospel story. It's the story of the incarnation and the salvation of Christ's church through his life, death, and resurrection. And then another work is Samson Agonistes. That's another one that's worth a read. These are both things that you should read, and I'm going to cover them in another video, just touching on them a little bit more. So I'm not going to say anything now for the sake of brevity, even though I'm probably already talking a little bit too much here. But he's also going to publish a collection of his poems that he wrote throughout the 1640s. This is going to be published in 1673. And on this very collection, the great early Romantic poet William Wordsworth would say that these poems made him wish that Milton were still living at this hour, talking, of course, about his career in the late 18th, early 19th century, writing some profound poetic works of his own. Um, so that's pretty much all I have as far as context for Milton, his life, and just what's going on in England at the time. I certainly hope this is helpful as you read through the poem and it starts to spark ideas for discussion in your mind. I'm going to do a video just talking about the literary reception of Milton throughout the 18th through 20th centuries, and then as I said, I'm going to do a video where I actually talk about those works a little bit more. So that's all I have for now. Thank you and God bless.